to know who's in the audience because we're going to be asking a lot of open-ended questions, and we want to get a sense of if we have a science-focused audience, an art-focused audience, how many of you are teachers and what you teach. So please participate in these polls as we start to introduce our session.
Great, and I am Sally Otis. I am an education specialist at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And as those polls are going, it looks like we have a lot of people with science background, and kind of split science, art, and other, and a lot of middle schools as well as a lot of other grade levels that you teach, and probably some who aren't associated with a school. Wonderful. I wanted to get started, and we're actually going to open with a question. What role does water play in your life? So we'd like you to think about, what does water mean to you, and what is your relationship with water? You might also think about how that has evolved over time. And you can go ahead and answer this question over in the Q&A section now. But also think about this question throughout our presentation. And later on, we'll return back to this question and we'll discuss it a little bit more and see if any of your answers have changed or anything you might add to your initial response as we're going through. So Suzannah and I have mentioned we work at the American Art Museum, so there's no mention of science or water experts in our title or in our organization. We are actually art museum educators, so we have a little bit of a different perspective about water and the role that it plays in our lives. And today we're going to look at artworks from the collection of the museum and discuss the role that water plays in American history, industry, society, and ecology. And first, I'll look at water as it was used as a symbol to represent our country. And then we'll look at the competing factors of the natural beauty of water versus utilizing it for the power of industry. And then I'll turn it over to Suzannah, who will look at our attempt at dominating or controlling water for our benefit and the impact of our relationship with this natural element. So to begin, we're going to start looking at this artwork of Niagara Falls. And if you could answer the question, again over in the Q&A section, of adjectives that describe Niagara as it's painted here by Alvin Fisher. So you can start typing your responses, and while you're thinking about that, I'll explain a little bit about this painting. Aside from the utilitarian purpose that water plays in our lives, it's also a place for recreation and tourism. And this painting was done by Alvin Fisher in 1820 of Niagara Falls. I'm sure those of you who have been to the falls or have seen recent pictures of the falls can see that this painting is quite a bit different from Niagara today. And here I have a picture, kind of an aerial view of Niagara. And most people, at least within the United States and Canada, are familiar with Niagara Falls, which is located in upstate New York on the border between the US and Canada. And that border falls right about here. Niagara Falls is comprised of 3 falls. We have the American Falls over here, Bridal Falls, and then this falls, which is called Canadian or Horseshoe Falls. And as I mentioned, that border between America and the US and Canada falls right in between those falls there. So Alvin Fisher's painting is approximately from this vantage point, which is right now a sidewalk, and looking out over Horseshoe Falls. Of course, Fisher's painting is a little bit different because of erosion, so he would have had a different view. But Niagara has fascinated many by its power and beauty, and the museum's collection alone, there are about 30 artworks that feature the falls. Fisher's painting is one of these that shows a much earlier version of the falls, and in a natural setting. You can see there isn't the cement sidewalks, there's not the lighting display, and it's before the crowds of people. Fisher uses the detail in the artwork to convey to us, the viewer, about how impressive the falls are. So we do see the people that are located here, and we can see the women that are covering up their ears, looking at this group over here. they're kind of covering their ears, and one woman is really kind of squatting down against the power, that's a sound of the falls, as this man is trying to probably shout over the falls, explaining about it. And then we see this group over here, almost daredevils, seeing how close they can get to the edge and leaning in towards it, and it creates this kind of tension of hoping that a strong wind doesn't come, sweep them up, and push them over the edge. And even the trees over here on the left side seem to be countering that tension, leaning back away from the power of the falls. And you can just imagine if this poor little dog were to get swept up by a great gust of wind and get plundered. So,
as Ashley just mentioned in the comment section, when you zoom in on this, it's almost like you are closer to the perspective of the people in the painting, and it gives you a different view of the falls themselves. And they become even more powerful, which is one of the adjectives that you've shared. The list was so long and wonderful. I'm just going to highlight 3 of them. Powerful is one, and that's perhaps why it was such an important symbol of a new country. We wanted to project this image of us as a powerful country. Loud was another one I really liked because, of course, a painting doesn't come with sound, but the artist gives us the sense of that noise anyway. And undeveloped, because we are going to be looking at images of water through time, and this issue of development is going to come up.
Exactly. And as we look at the full picture, in 1820, this painting of Niagara would have read very similar to what everyone else is commenting on. It's a symbol of our young country. Our country was still a little undeveloped. We were still establishing ourselves and our independence. And the powerful Niagara became a symbol of our grand landscape. So the untouched beauty of this natural wonder really represented the power and energy of our new nation. So this is one example of water being used as a symbol for the country. And now I want to look at an artwork done almost 50 years later. So this is where natural beauty of the landscape starts to intersect with the Industrial Revolution. So we're now harnessing the power of water for industry, and the steamboat, which we can see over here, becomes a powerful symbol of progress and innovation. So this starts to pose a dilemma for landscape artists like Samuel Coleman, who painted this artwork. And one art critic wrote about this painting, saying that it marks the moment when paradise was invaded by men of commerce. Painters were left with a problem, what to do about tanning factories, sawmills, paper factories, and the other businesses that started to overtake the epic waterfalls and elegant forests along the Hudson. So in Coleman's work, he's grappling with this question of industry versus natural beauty. And he decides to balance the two by dividing his work into 2 halves. Both industry and paradise occupy the artwork, seemingly equal, but what is the relationship between these two? So is Coleman portraying these 2 ideas as friends, able to live in harmony, or as foes in competition with each other? And we'll pose this question to all of you, which you can comment on again in the Q&A. And as we take a look at some of the visual evidence we see in this painting about the relationship between these 2 sides. So starting on the right side of Storm King, it seems to be dedicated to this idea of paradise. We see the Storm King mountain over here, as well as the clouds and the sky, take up about 2/3 of the artwork. It's also, we have this kind of spotlit town at the base of the mountain with a little ray of sunshine lighting it. And we have this very calm water. Both the sailboats and the fishing boats are really dwarfed by the nature and really seem to be secondary to the beauty of the nature. So here it seems that nature and industry can really peacefully coexist. The fishermen are out catching their fish, but you know, they're allowed to kind of exist in this environment. On the left side, industry is definitely dominating nature. So even the simple rowboat, which we have over here on the left side, seems like it's going to be crushed by some of these barges and steamships as they roll through. And the puffs of steam almost look like it's hitting the corner edge of the painting, and as though it's going to start to fill and take over the whole sky. But the sky itself appears a little more peaceful than the right half. It's a brighter sky. There is a bird flying overhead, actually 2 birds, one there and one over there. But there's also this split between the mountains on either sides of the ship. So it's almost as though the mountains and nature are parting ways to make way for this industry that's coming through. So the 2 halves are very equally balanced, but again, is it a calm balance in harmony or a competing tug of war between industry and nature? On the right side, it seems that these 2 ideas are coexisting in harmony, but on the left, it seems a little bit more of a power struggle. And there's also this triangle of power that you can draw. Oops. There we go. Between the different types of boats. So we have the steamship, the rowboat, and the sailboat. And the triangle seems to be pointing more towards the powerful steamship, which is a prevalent technology in 1866. And in fact, most of the diagonals in this artwork, from the mountains here, the clouds, all seem to be pointing down towards the steamship. And I find it interesting that the ships that are powered by nature, the sailboats, are placed in the background. So almost as though they're relegated to the past.
So it's interesting, we use this work a lot in groups in the gallery when teachers come to the museum to look at things in person. And some of the feedback we get is that this friend or foe issue is not clear-cut at all, but it's very interesting to look for arguments on either side. What people most often notice is that the blue sky is seen more clearly, as Sally mentioned, on the side with industry. So even though we have this big sort of dark plume of smoke that people today would certainly read as pollution, the blue sky seems to be on the side of industry. So maybe that's an argument that Coleman is more in favor, perhaps, of industry, or feels that progress is a good thing. Whereas the sailboats and the rowboats are on the side with the storm clouds that Storm King is known for. So it's certainly a debate. And I'm seeing some interesting comments popping up right now that indigenous boats and crafts are totally absent. You're right. So this is certainly progress as of 1866. We certainly see the lack of the Native American culture that would have been present here before the Industrial Revolution. So keep thinking about this artwork, because we're going to return to this question of kind of friend or foe, antagonist, protagonist. But we're going to do it with another artwork that explores the interplay between man and the river. This one was created about 80 years after Samuel Coleman's painting. And I show it like this to begin with to show you the whole thing all at once, but this is a mural. It's 22 feet long by 5 feet high. And Sally and I really want you to be able to explore it in detail. So we're going to look at it several different ways. For example, we can hopefully animate it. So this is what it might be like to walk past the whole mural in the galleries. Sally just put the link in the comments so that you can follow that and explore on your own. And here is the work in the museum with some of our lovely 8th graders exploring it. And I want to give a little shout out to my colleague Ade Gayoso, who is in the audience as well and is shown in this photograph presenting to students. So that should give you a sense of its scale. As we discuss it, Sally and I are going to break it into 3 sections. We're going to start here in the center section, because that's kind of where the main action, the main story is going on. So we see a bull has escaped, the rope is broken that was holding him back, and one man is coming straight at him, reaching for his horns.
And we also see the setting, some of the details that the artist included, like the farm in the background with the silo in the barn, this rider on the horse, all kind of giving us a sense of where this action is taking place. And
there's even more of an audience off to the side. There are these somewhat strange, incongruous figures. You might not expect to see them in this farm setting. So there might be a clue that there's something more going on than meets the eye.
And also those figures look as though, if they're watching this, if it were at a rodeo or something, they'd be in bleachers, but instead they're on this kind of odd horn. So again, more clues that there's more to this than just a man and a bull catching a bull that's out of control.
Right. The funny thing about this audience is that, especially if you're at a rodeo, you might be a little bit more interested in the proceedings than this woman in blue. She looks almost bored. So if we move to the left,
it seems like these people are more in touch with reality. I noticed that the people see something is going wrong, and so there's all this forward motion to go and help. We have the two figures, the man on the fence and then the man in the red shirt, that are a little more alarmed, especially than the woman who is bored.
And there are more indications that we're on a farm. We have silo here, wheelbarrow, and then all the way off to the side we have this figure who most people who come into the galleries point out as being the only African American figure in the scene.
And over on this side we have even more ideas or clues, visual clues, giving us a sense of where this is taking place. Now we bring in the water or the river that's in the background, and some of these low hills or very short mountains, kind of giving us this idea that it's in the Midwest, along with kind of being on a farm. And it's not just any river. This is actually the Missouri River, and the artist was from Missouri, which is what helped us place where the action is going on.
And the last detail I want to point out is here we see the open end of the horn, and we see it's not just any old horn, it's actually a horn of plenty. There are all these crops spilling out of it, all this kind of richness of the harvest. So again, not what you might expect to see in your typical farm scene. And these are all clues that it is not just your typical farm scene. In fact, it's a Greek myth that the artist has set in his own Missouri of the 1940s. And the myth is that of the struggle between Achelous, who is the river god, who in flood takes on the form of a bull. And he is fighting with Hercules, who in this painting is shown in Levi's, who is, a great hero of Greek mythology, over a girl. And the girl is this one in blue who looks so bored. And she represents land, because this is a woman, an heiress, who has a lot of land. So it's man and river fighting over land. And we can kind of tell this is going on because we see this woman in red with this swoosh, and this is the goddess Nike. She holds a laurel wreath over Dianara's head, marking her as the prize of this fight. And as the story goes, the fight ends with Hercules ripping off one of Achelous' horns, and that horn turns into the Horn of Plenty. So I want to pose another open-ended question at this point. We first looked at Fisher's Niagara. He was celebrating the power of water. Then Coleman, Storm King, was demonstrating the role of river in industry. Now this artist, Thomas Hart Benton, his river is a fierce bull waiting to be conquered. If you were to write your own story, we want to know, would water be an antagonist or a protagonist, and why? And this is maybe an opportunity. I saw someone was here from Mississippi. I'd be very interested to hear if you have experienced any particular events with water, because we're going to be talking about some natural disasters, of course, that water can bring on. So, looking at this artwork, which is titled Achelous and Hercules, we as museum educators, we approach it. The main questions we typically ask are, why was this painted, and what can we learn from it? What is the so what of the artwork? So starting with the first question, why was this painted? We're lucky enough in this case that we have a source that really clarifies the artist, Thomas Hart Benton, his intentions, and that source is a myth that he wrote. Oops, I forgot I have these labels to show you who all the figures are, so we'll return to those in a minute. But this artist wrote up the myth as part of a brochure that was handed out to people viewing the mural. The mural was intended for a department store. We'll see a picture of that in just a moment. And this is how he chose to conclude this brochure. He said, Hercules' victory over Achelous symbolized victory over the river by the building of embankments, canals, etc., and the overcoming of the yearly terrors of flood. The conquering of the river bull is a symbol of the redemption of riverland and the turning of it by labor to plenty. The story is thus applicable to our own land. It fits our Missouri River, which yet needs the attention of Hercules. So, Here we see those original labels that shows you who each character is, matched with sort of their significance in this metaphor. So this bull is not just the river god, he is the river in flood, so he's the Missouri River in flood. Hercules here stands in for us, for our attempts at flood control. Dianara, who was the landowner in the competition, she stands in for the land. And of course the cornucopia is the Midwestern goal of having a good harvest of lots of crops to support and feed people. Another way we can get a clue as to the artist's intentions is to look at early drafts, studies for the mural. And this one has some quite interesting changes. We see on the top here is the draft, and here is the final mural that we've just been looking at. And I'm just going to point out a few of the big changes. First of all, the position of the river. In the draft, it runs all the way along the top of the mural. In fact, it even seems to mimic the line of the bull, which might help connect the bull with the idea of the river. In the final mural, he really concentrated the action in the center here, and he moved the river over here. Makes it a bit harder to me to make that connection. The other major change that I saw was here, there's a horse or a donkey up here with a rider. So it's an animal that is harnessed by man. In the study, there are two animals here running free. That almost seems to suggest that the artist was more interested in nature unharnessed at that point. And of course, that might not be relevant to our theme of water. There's no, these two side figures have been deleted, so there's no African American figure in the study. That was added later. Now, I mentioned that this was intended for a public space. It was here in Hartzfeld's department store over the elevators. So here are some elevators, and the mural hangs above those three. And this is where the brochure the artist wrote was distributed to patrons. And this is really significant because murals for public spaces are extremely different from artworks created for gallery or museum usage. The artist was conscious that he was creating a work that would be part of the daily life of people, not just those who have actively chosen an art experience by entering a museum, but people who are going about their daily lives and shopping. And that leads me to talking more about the artist himself, because he saw himself as the artist of the people. So that's why he chose to work in murals. This is Thomas Hart Benton. As you can see from the basic biographical info I put in there, he was born in the town of Neosho, Missouri, which is actually quite far from the Missouri River. But after training in New York City, he spent most of his adult life in Kansas City, Missouri. As I mentioned, he wanted to be one of the artists of the people. He is part of a group called the Regionalists, which were a small group of artists that painted American folk heroes, American landscapes, and this is all while the mainstream art world is exploring abstraction. His dedication to public service we can probably stem back to his family. His father, Maecenas Benton, was a 4-term congressman. So in addition to Missouri and New York, young Tom Benton spent quite a bit of his childhood in Washington, D.C. And if you visited D.C. and our major public buildings, you notice that murals have a very important role in those buildings. They really have many messages to send. So young Benton really realized that art could influence political ideas and policies as much as law could. And he resisted the law career that his father wanted him to have. His political heritage goes back even further, actually. His great-uncle, who shared his name, was the Senator Thomas Hart Benton, and he was a leading figure during westward expansion. So Fort Benton on the upper Missouri is named after him, which is another connection this artist has to this land. He called murals the highest form of art, and I'm quoting here, the return of art to a place in society. Whereas paintings on canvas, paintings that are meant for non-public spaces or museum spaces, were simply studio play dedicated to a small class. So he feels that murals are really the democratic form of art. So in this photo, though, he's not looking at his mural, he's looking at another painting he created on a similar subject. And understanding that painting is actually going to help us understand more about what's going on in Achilles and Hercules and its bigger significance. But I'm going to return to that once I tell you a bit more about Benton himself. Sally and I were fortunate enough to visit Benton's home in Kansas City. He moved here in 1939, lived here till his death in 1975, and it's now a state historic home where you can visit. We stopped into his studio, which looks exactly the way it did on the day he died in his studio, And I didn't really know exactly what I was taking a photograph here, but if you zoom in, you'll notice that above his desk, he has photographs of himself with Truman, President Truman, and also of a classical sculpture. So I love this because it really shows both his interest in classical mythology and also in politics and spreading a message to the public. His mural, Atlas and Hercules, quite coincidentally ended up being his audition piece to become artist laureate to the Truman administration. So there's a reason there's a picture of Truman in that studio. Now, if we look at a map of Kansas City, you can see why the rivers might have quite an impact on the city. Here is Kansas City. The big blue line here is the Missouri, and we're also seeing the tributaries, the Kansas and Kaw rivers. So right at the center of it. So floods, regular floods, happened every few years. There was a big flood on the Missouri in 1943. The mural that we've been looking at, Atlas and Hercules, was commissioned in 1946, so it's likely that the big flood in 43 would have influenced his choice of subject. However, the biggest flood of the area was the flood of the Kaw River in 1951, and that is the flood that ended up, where Benton ended up having the most influence. Here are some shots of the devastation of the 1951 Kaw River flood. Congress appropriated $25 million in flood relief during the summer right after this flood at Truman's recommendation. Truman didn't think that was enough. Benton didn't think that was enough. They wanted to propose a great deal more in flood relief. In fact, this photo I know is quite small. These are people who have been hit by this flood asking for more grants and more aid. Here we see the water line on the towns along the Kaw and some of the fires that broke out by industrial accidents. So Benton acted. He sent this letter. This is a shortened version of the letter that I wanted to read today. Along with that image we saw before, he made a print from his painting, and he sent a copy of this print, this lithograph, to every member of Congress, which in 1951 was 96 senators and 435 congressmen. And this was his attempt to encourage them to vote in favor. And he writes, "Dear Congress, it is now more than 90 days since floodwaters hit the valleys out here. 90 days of rack, ruin, muck, and stink. The attached lithograph shows what things are like, as of this day, for thousands of poor, hopeless sons of man in the Kaw River Basin. It is given to you in the hope that you'll forget the academics of precedent and get out a new bill which will relieve the human side of this rotting catastrophe." So you see he's really fighting for more aid to the people. He's not talking directly about flood control here, which I find quite interesting, but he is visiting people, talking to people, and trying to spread their story. Now, the history of this lithograph becomes quite interesting. In fact, the specific bill that he was throwing his support behind did not pass. This was Truman and Senator Bowling, a senator from Missouri. It was their attempt to appropriate $400 million more in flood relief, split between loans and flood insurance. And then Bowling even added an amendment that did not pass for grants and aid to help people from this river valley recover. Benton's lithograph didn't have the impact it intended, but if we look at the full story, we can see the print did have an effect in the long run. That's because it was widely publicized. It made the cover of New Republic in November 1951, along with a 4-page article that New Republic had commissioned Benton to write about the flood. And then there was a great article about Senator Bowling from Missouri rescuing the lithographs from the trash. Some congressmen and senators had tossed them right into the bin when they received them. Flood control was an extremely contentious issue, so I think we can see why that happened. And Bowling was able to turn that into a wonderful publicity stunt for flood relief. He auctioned off all of the lithographs that he saved and made money that way, and he got more press with a great photograph of him with his desk covered with copies of Benton's print. There was a funny poem about that was also published about congressmen not appreciating art. This is not to say that no one in Congress appreciated Benton's gesture. About 60 wrote to thank him personally. And finally, Newsweek ran the print again in December 1951, and we think that might have influenced a later vote in the House that gave $55 million more in flood relief. If we look back at the print, Benton's river here is being defeated. Man is victorious over nature, winning control of land, harvesting the bounty. But what's interesting is that Benton didn't necessarily support flood control as much as the print and his description of the print written in 1947 might indicate. He may have initially, I haven't been able to track down specific sources, but his writing is all about flood relief for people, not control of the river. But the 1943 flood that might have inspired Atlas and Hercules also inspired the Flood Control Act, which later resulted in a plan to control the river known as the Pick-Sloan Plan. And I'm not going to go into the details of the debate over the Pick-Sloan Plan or even the details of the plan itself because they're immensely complicated. What I am going to do is look at it from the benefit of hindsight. This is a table that the Bureau of Reclamation, which is one of the two federal agencies responsible for water control, put together in the year 2000. And this is looking at the original goals of the Pick-Sloan Missouri River Basin Project and stacking those up to the actual results of the plan. And we can see that they did achieve some of those goals. In terms of storage capacity, they exceeded the goals, and the same in terms of hydropower generation. And they credit the Pick-Sloan Plan with $25 billion saved in flood control, lots of recreational benefits. But it's the last two that are the most interesting because this is where they did not hit their goal. They wanted to improve navigation, industrial navigation along the Missouri, and they didn't come close to achieving that goal. As you can see, the goal was 20 million tons a year, and they hit 1.8 million tons per year. And the big one is irrigation. The goals along the upper Missouri was to improve irrigation for farming, which is very much in line with Benton's painting. And the goal was 5 million acres. They achieved less than 600,000 acres. That's considered perhaps a major failing of the Pick-Sloan Plan. And this chart doesn't really give us the full story because they're looking at it purely based on the original goals of the plan. Here are some additional results. These are perhaps the unanticipated consequences of the bill. 3 million miles of natural river habitat was altered. So sometimes we can't anticipate exactly what's going to happen. We're still not sure exactly what the environmental impact of that is going to be. And then there's the human impact. These projects displaced 3 Native American nations from their ancestral lands. More environmental impacts. Most, if not all, of the native fish species are in trouble along the Missouri. And then, surprisingly, they found that constraining and changing the course of the water might actually make some of the flooding worse. So while they may have prevented floods in some areas, they may have contributed to flooding in others. Perhaps the best way to sum it all up is this quote from historian Robert K. Schneiders. He says, "No one will ever know enough about the Missouri River to regulate its flows effectively. It possesses too many characteristics, it is influenced by innumerable external factors, and its waters behave in an unpredictable fashion." Benton, at least in 1965, which is the next point we hear from him on this subject, believed in, he was sided with Robert Schneiders. The Army Corps of Engineers, who were the agency responsible for much of the Pick-Sloan plan, invited Benton to join them on a survey trip of the upper Missouri in '65. And that trip was chronicled in an article in the Saturday Evening Post. And Benton is quoted as really telling the engineers to leave the river alone. He's very much not in favor at this point. So if he had been in favor of flood control in 1947 when he painted the mural, he had changed his mind by 1965 when more of the effects were known. And many blame Pick-Sloan for later floods along the Missouri and Mississippi. And that leads me back to the second question I posed when we started to look at this mural, which is what can we learn from this artwork? One of the most interesting things we've done with students was a partnership with a middle school where the teachers were interested in connecting artworks from our collection from different time periods with contemporary events that still had resonance for the students. And working in DC, the flood that had the most impact on students here and obviously got the most press was Hurricane Katrina. And there is some connection between Benton's 1947 mural and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And a lot of that is the issue of man and nature, and the impact that the Army Corps of Engineers projects from the 30s, 40s, even 50s and 60s had on Katrina in 2005. And one specific connection that we used with students was the story of Mr. Go. Mr. Go is the Missouri River Gulf outlet. It was completed in 1968 to provide a shorter route between the Gulf of Mexico and the New Orleans Inner Harbor. And it was meant to help, again, industrial navigation. But as you can see from this chart, here is the big view of Mr. Go connecting the Gulf of Mexico up to New Orleans here. And if we look over at this chart, what ended up happening in Katrina is that it funneled the storm directly into the city and into the lower 9th Ward. So what we did with the students is have them consider the pros and cons of Mr. Go and create a debate. And I have to admit they struggled mightily to find the pros. The original goal of the Mr. Go project was shipping, so they did list that as a pro, and of course it employed people both in constructing it and in shipping, but it never came close to meeting its goals in those regards. By contrast, the con list was long. This is just a selected element of the crucial cons. And the first one is probably the most important. The project destroyed 24,000 acres of wetlands. Now, if we look at the science of storms, a mile of marsh is a form of wetland, will reduce a coastal storm surge wave by about 1 inch. So if we think about how Katrina went over those levees, think about how many fewer inches we could have handled and how much the impact of those wetlands could have had. So it never reached its goals. It destroyed the wetlands. It channeled the storm surge directly into New Orleans. It led to the disappearance of the coastland. So we used this as a discussion to prompt the issue of man and nature in the classroom.
And we can also see in Benton's mural this intersection of man and nature as well. Throughout, Benton gives us a lot of examples of this intersection. And it's interesting to look through and find where man seems to have the upper hand and where nature is starting to take over. For example, the kind of ivy or these vines that are growing on the left-hand side over the fence of the mural seem to be kind of reclaiming their rightful spot. And then on the right-hand side, however, we have this bounty, the crops that we're able to harvest because of our relationship with water and able to harness that for our use. And of course, literally right in the center, we have Hercules wrestling with water in the form of Achelous, really portraying this delicate balance that we have to have. And as many of you mentioned at the beginning when we asked about water as an antagonist or protagonist, someone described it as a flawed protagonist or an anti-hero. And I really liked, someone mentioned it was a Jekyll Hyde character. And I really think that's true and really demonstrated both with Benton and, as Suzannah has mentioned, with what water gives us, but then also what water can take away, and for example, with Katrina. So to close out our session about water in American art, I want to revisit Niagara Falls, but now with a 20th century photograph. So earlier, someone described Alvin Fisher's Niagara that we looked at as powerful. And this artwork also shows power, but in a new and modern way. So this photo is by John Fall. It's upstream from the falls themselves, and it's focusing on the power plants that man has built there and how we've harnessed the falls power for electricity. And I think it's important to recognize how our own views and attitudes towards water have changed over time, how they've been affected by the development of new technology or natural disasters. Because I think if we were to look at this photograph from the perspective of Alvin Fisher or someone in the 1800s, this artwork is also portraying water as this great symbol of our power. It's letting us achieve these amazing things like lighting a major city. Water supports industry and innovation. It's a testament to industrialization. So this photograph is really showing our ability to harness the power for our benefit. And the power plant becomes more of a literal symbol of our country's power. But if we look at this photograph from a more contemporary or 21st century lens, then it starts to spark a conversation about our impact on the environment. And as we've talked about, when there are disastrous intersections with water, like floods or tsunamis, water can play the role of antagonist in our lives as well. So this photograph can then be used to spark a discussion about how our actions and interventions in an attempt to control the water actually causes other potentially negative results and potentially more harmful than if we had just left well enough alone. For example, we're no longer looking at a natural riverside landscape here, but at a man-made structure and a bank that was carved out of the land. You can actually see some of the drill marks drilled down through the rock. And water itself in this photograph is actually really dark and subdued. It's very much dominated in the composition by the land and the power plant, and there's very little untouched nature that is being shown.
I'm going to conclude today by just returning to the very first question we asked you, which is what role does water play in your life? And I think your answers really fit into our idea that of the evolution of humans' relationship with water. That was very well represented. And what I found interesting is many commenters listed multiple uses in one comment. So on one hand, we saw words like beauty, recreation, art, but the same commenters also listed survival and practical ways we rely on water, like sanitation. And then several of you really got to the next level and focused on the role water plays in our identity, which is another theme that links all the artworks we've seen today. Artists are always trying to play with identity, personal and national. And I love that the students in Nevada know that even humans are 2/3 water ourselves. We really can't escape this relationship. And perhaps our final thought is that we seem to continually battle with how to coexist with water. We can't live without it, covers most of the Earth's surfaces, but many don't have access to drinkable water, and of course the water can also be a destructive force in our lives.
Intriguing. I'm fascinated by Benton's work in particular, and his images that represent so many different aspects on varying levels. And of course, Sally, you made the point that our actions and interventions really are interpreted over time, and none of us can see forward, although we hope that we are forward-looking at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you both, and thank you to the sponsors for our Sheld Conference, the Smithsonian Institution, Microsoft Partners in Learning, and Taking It Global.